Welcome to Novelist Spotlight. This is Mike Consul, your host. In addition to being the host of this podcast and interviewing novelists, I am a novelist myself. I have 3 published novels. My latest is titled Lolita Firestone, a supernatural novel, and it is set in Sedona, Arizona and Cairo, Egypt. My previous novel is titled Family Recipes, a novel about Italian culture, Catholic guilt, and the culinary crime of the century. And my first novel is named Hardwood, a novel about college basketball and other games young men play. And that story deals with issues ranging from depression and racism to sex, religion, and university politics. All 3 novels are listed in the episode notes. I hope you will buy them, I hope you will read them, and I hope you will thoroughly enjoy them. Now, on with our program. In the spotlight is Don DeLillo. Ask any literary critics to name their top 5 greatest American novelists of the past 50 years, and Don DeLillo's name is sure to make the top 5 repeatedly, likely the top 3. Now, for me, it was 1985 when I read a New York Times book review cover review about a novel titled White Noise. An effusive review it was, and the novel went on to win the 1985 National Book Award for Fiction. I bought the novel based on the New York Times book review, and it became and still stands today as my favorite novel of all time. And I've read almost every novel that Don DeLillo has written. I believe it's about 19 now. I've been a fan ever since. End Zone is another favorite, hysterically funny, but also incisive. Don DeLillo himself describes his themes as living in dangerous times and the inner life of the culture. And I always tell people the overarching theme of White Noise is the fear of death. There's a lot more to it than just the fear of death, but that and it fits those themes that he just cited. It's also a very funny novel, but not in a punchline sort of way. That's what's really important about it, is that it's not as though there's a lot of writers who are funny, but and DeLillo, I wouldn't say is a comedic writer except for a couple of his books, or a few of them, but it's probably fairer to say. But it's not a punchline sort of thing. It's the humor or the comedy of what he writes is embedded in each sentence, or and what he has to say about characters or the observations he makes, which I think is really critical. So he was born November 20, 1936. That means he, a fellow Scorpio like me. He was born in the Bronx, New York. That makes him 87 years old currently, which is hard to believe that Don DeLillo is already, pushing 90. He was already a well-regarded cult writer in 1985 when White Noise exploded on the scene. I keep referencing White Noise, but the truth is that he's got several landmark novels, including Underworld and Libra. There's Falling Man about the 9/11 attack and so on. When White Noise came out, though, that's when he got really widespread recognition and moved on from there. So where's Don DeLillo? Well, he's not with us. He's not on this podcast. I figured I had no shot at getting him. He doesn't really do interviews except very rarely. He's an intensely private writer. I've heard a few interviews on maybe 1 or 2 on YouTube actually that he did to promote a novel or 2. So I did the next best thing. I asked members of the Don DeLillo Society to join me in discussing the great author, and that would be Aaron DeRosa and Jesse Kavadlo. Aaron and Jesse, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much, Mike.
Let me start by asking you, how did each of you get turned on to Don DeLillo's writing and career?
Man, I encountered White Noise in college and was obsessed. But I think what really got me into it, my mentor in my PhD program was John Duvall, who has written a great deal on DeLillo before. And that's, I think, where my interest sort of grew. Don DeLillo's Underworld and Falling Man. Those were the 2 big ones that I just sunk my teeth into and fell in love.
Yeah, so in the early 90s, I read White Noise for the first time, and I honestly can't tell you why I read it, how it got into my hands, but I really loved it. I fell in love with the book right away, and I felt very much like this was a book that felt like it was written just for me. As it turns out, I had started my PhD program that year, at Fordham University. So I was sort of unnerved to discover that DeLillo was a Fordham alum and had grown up in the area just outside of Fordham University. So when it came time to pick a dissertation topic, it seemed like kind of obvious and natural that I would go that route. I had written a master's degree about Nathaniel West, who I also loved very much, but DeLillo was just the next level for me.
Yeah, so White Noise is so it was where you guys started as well, and funny book, very serious book, but also a funny book. But it's not the sort of thing that everybody picks up. It's not consistent with everybody's sense of humor. But again, because Don DeLillo delivers information even when he's being funny, um, and it's just part and parcel who the characters are. The dialogue is otherworldly and so on. But what about you two guys? Did you find it to be a comedic novel at all, or did you just find it to be that was that kind of not part of your experience?
It was very much a part of my experience. I also thought it was just about the funniest thing and the best thing that I ever read up until that point. I found myself just, reading passages out loud pretty much to anybody who would listen at that point. I've now taught the novel to undergraduates a lot of times. I teach it about every 2 years or so, and it does divide the class. It's pretty much the students who find it funny like it, and the students who find it not that funny don't like it nearly as much. I also teach classes that are mixed English majors and students who are taking the class for Gen Ed. And unfortunately, it seems to divide along pretty much those lines. The English majors like it, and the Gen Ed students don't particularly. But I'm going to keep teaching it anyway.
How about you, Aaron?
Yeah, it's definitely I'm from New York, so part of this I think feels very familiar. That sense of humor feels very familiar to me, and I don't know that I want to make that as a broad generalization for folks who read it, but I think there's something about DeLillo's writing that creates like what Jesse's describing, which is this. I don't want to call it antagonism, but people take sides on one side or another, right? And a class, particularly in a classroom, it'll balance itself out. If five students say, "Oh, I hated this. This is awful," then five students are going to jump in and say, "No, this was hysterical. Let me read you a line." And I think that it just sort of like balloons from there. My experience with it is my experience with reading DeLillo was at first, what is happening? I don't understand this. And then at a certain point, you just sort of snap into focus. And then the laughter comes. So it does
That
take something of a paradigm shift, I think, in your head.
that's a great characterization. That at first is kind of like what's going on here? Where is this going? And then you just kind of lock into his way of thinking and writing. And I will say that I remember I went to Amazon and there was somebody who had given it like 1 star or two, and it's like, how could you give it 1 or 2 stars? I read what he had to say, and he said you literally go on for pages with nothing happening, which I found to be astounding. But I think for people who are into a very hard driving plot, a very something that moves from place to place to place, that's not DeLillo's style. He's not a guy who's going to give you um, a hard narrative. He's much more ethereal than that. I think he's much more intellectual than that. It's not just a lot of people. If you read pop novels, uh, even though Don DeLillo's had some popular novels, including White Noise, that is not that's not his style at all. I mean, how would you guys characterize his writing style?
Well, I think you're onto something with his plots before we get to the writing style, which is that in some ways, and this is to me, this is a plus. This is the thing I like about the novels. He generally has these pretty high concept premises, like even in White Noise, what winds up being, the airborne toxic event and the chemical spill. I mean, in different hands, this would be, something like an entire adventure novel, which the film adaptation on Netflix from about 2 years ago did lean into that about halfway through. But DeLillo really isn't that interested in it. Like he introduces the concept and then he lets it go. One of my other favorite DeLillo novels is the somewhat lesser known Great Joan Street, which again introduces this kind of high concept of the rock star who's hiding from fame, who's kind of flirting with suicide, maybe even murder. And then the novel does not run with that premise. Or his last novel, The Silence. This again, the big sci-fi concept. What would happen if all the electricity or all the electronic devices stopped working. And then it winds up just being this almost absurdist play, almost has nothing to do with the concept. And I think that's really admirable. I was struck, Jennifer Egan's last book, The Candy House, did something very similar. I was like, this is great. I like the idea of the big concept, but let's just lean into the dialogue, the human elements, the stylistic elements, as opposed to let's turn this into a kind of blockbuster thing, an airport novel.
Exactly. Exactly. How
Yeah.
about you, Aaron?
Yeah, I was going to agree with that. I characterized DeLillo more as a cultural analyst rather than a storyteller. It's like a sociological stand-up. Everything is a one-liner about, what masses are thinking, or how a community is moving. And I think that's also where he gets that sort of like reputation for being a prophet, because he just has this sort of way of making these sweeping declarations about culture, and that doesn't drive plot, right? Like that, it doesn't even drive character development, which is another thing that readers sometimes get caught on. Like these characters aren't particularly uh, good or engaging, right? But there's something about them that captures an essence or captures a moment that we feel, and I think that's where he's most adept.
You
Right.
mentioned, oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
So when students complain in White Noise that the characters aren't round or well developed enough, I say to them, look, I've got some bad news. These are his roundest, most well developed characters in any of the novels. So we're gonna have to take that. But I did want to get back to your initial question, Mike, which was really the style, and that's probably my favorite thing about it, just the sentences themselves. I mean, you take again the really what for me are the masterpiece works, which is really the ones that you mentioned already: White Noise, Underworld, Libra. I mean, it's amazing that these are fairly long novels. Certainly, Underworld and Libra are long novels, and they almost demand to be read aloud, just in terms of the poetry of them, just the attention to the sentences. And when DeLillo has given interviews, if people have read the interviews, you know what I'm going to say. The way he talks about his process and using the typewriter and the white spaces on the page and what the sentence looks like on the page, and retyping, sentence after sentence on page after page, just because he has this idea of what sentences are supposed to look like. And to me, it also translates into what they sound like. Also, I mean, the work reads so well to the eyes and to the ear. It almost doesn't matter to me what he writes about.
I'm glad you make that point because, and we'll talk about his writing style in a little bit. I mean, his actual method, his methodology of writing, and his routine, at least when he was in his prime. It just probably changed as he's gotten, into his late 80s now. But I don't know. But that whole idea, my wife is a plot-driven sort of reader, and to her, I tell her, if the writing is good, the story doesn't really need to go anywhere for me. And I'm not just talking about DeLillo. I'm talking about any great writer. If they've got great characters, they've got great vignettes, they have sentences that are captivating or bring you to a halt. That's what matters to me. I don't need necessarily certainly not a hard storyline, or maybe even any storyline at all. Now, DeLillo does tell us, certainly White Noise tells a story, and some of his others like End Zone, which is one of my favorites as well, because it really truly is a funny novel that goes well beyond college football. Aaron, did you want to weigh in on that though? Just the writing style itself?
Yeah, just to add, every sentence for DeLillo is punctuated with something, right? Like his sentences are just very staccato. They stand out, and I think that even shorter novels, they just have this ability to make you pause at every period. And I think that's just the way that he freights language in this very unique way. It doesn't let you speed through. It doesn't let you move from one idea to the next or one scene to the next. It requires that you pause at each moment, and I think that that's something very powerful in his writing.
Yeah, he is also the only writer I've ever felt anxiety and was laughing, literally inside, just internal laughter and feeling anxiety at the same time. It was one of the sentences in White Noise, but it was really kind of the build up to that sentence, and then kind of this payload that he delivered. Now, one of you had mentioned, DeLillo the Prophet. And when you think back, he writes White Noise. A central event, of course, is the airborne toxic event. And he wrote that novel just before the Bhopal, India event, where hundreds of people were killed because of a toxic event coming from a Dow Chemical or DuPont plant. I forget which one, but it was one of the major U.S. Chemical companies. And Mao too, he talked about the only way to get people's attention anymore is terrorism. And this was before, obviously, the Irish Republican Army was doing its thing, but we didn't even call it terrorism at the time, really. It wasn't, it was shortly after that, the terror type tactics and events were happening in a big way. And it's almost like, how did he see this coming in that way? Then you go to Underworld and you've got the cover with the Twin Towers in a jet, not hitting them, but you see a jet there. Or is it a bird? I forget if it's a jet or a bird, but it makes it look, it was almost like he was telegraphing. And I do believe that came out before 9/11. Is that right? Or do I have my timing off?
No, you're right. I think it's 97.
So what about, and maybe I'm leaving something out. I think there was maybe even a fourth thing. It was just like, how did DeLillo know that this was going to happen or have this kind of insight into our society? But I mean, he really does write very much about these really incisive viewpoints of the culture and how people really kind of think on a little bit different level. I keep coming back to the word otherworldly with DeLillo's writing, because there's always a sense that you're not really quite in reality. There's a kind of you're on a little bit of maybe a little bit of out of the body, a little bit of astral plane sort of consciousness. Maybe he doesn't necessarily write on a daily consciousness plane. He seems to be just a bit ajar. Does that make any sense to you guys?
Oh, sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of other examples too. I mean, Cosmopolis came out in 2001, and that pretty clearly presages the Occupy Wall Street movement. And then more recently, then this got some press. The White Noise movie that came out 2 years ago. Very shortly after the movie was released, there was a train derailment, chemical spill in I think it was East Palestine, but I don't think it's pronounced Palestine. But it's a very DeLillo-esque name for a city. And there was a chemical spill, and the way that this was written up was something along the lines of some of the extras who played evacuees of the chemical spill in the White Noise movie really had to evacuate because of the real life train derailment chemical spill in Ohio. So people were really thrown by this. And I found myself pulled into this a little bit because CNN actually contacted me for a quote about this, which I gave them. And I thought it was pretty good. And I used the word coincidental to talk about, obviously this is coincidental, but it suggests, how in tune DeLillo has been. And this wound up, I think like a lot of academics, you can back me up on this, Aaron, if it's true. I have a Google alert out on my name in case anybody cites me. And I found myself being talked about in a subreddit about conspiracies, how I must obviously be an agent of the deep state to suggest that this is coincidental because it was one of these kind of what the conspiracy theorists call predictive programming. In other words, they knew this was going to happen. I'm like, wow, how did my name get pulled into this?
So you're part of it all, Jesse.
Yeah. So that, you write about
I can
DeLillo
neither
for long
confirm nor
enough.
deny.
DeLillo has had his 1 foot in conspiracies from the very beginning, and now I've got a foot in it too. But the thing about it for me is that DeLillo is just very, very in tune with what's going on in the culture. I mean, he was writing about terrorism in the 70s too, Players, Running Dogs, some of the earlier novels. So I think when you pay that much attention to what's happening in the culture, it starts to look like you can see into the future. But really, he's just a very astute observer, student, kind of finger on the pulse person. And so he writes what he observes, and it turns out that he just observes a little better than everybody else.
Yeah, he anticipates. He really anticipates. It's kind of remarkable, and he's done it repeatedly. I mean, just these examples that we were just talking about. That he just seems tapped in. He obviously keeps up on current events and also technologies, futuristic type stuff. I mean, he's written about cryonics and a lot of different things that have to do with paying a lot of attention to what's happening out there. What about that White Noise? Oh, go ahead and add, and then I want to ask you guys about the movie White Noise. Go ahead. Aaron?
Yeah, so I was thinking about this while we were talking about, what is it that drives this prophetic nature of his writing. And I think it's, for some writers, they write characters, right? They understand deep personal emotion. They understand they understand that uh, what fills us as humans. And I think for DeLillo, there's something about his ability to do that at the level of culture. It's underlying feelings about people, movements, masses, groups, factions. It's not about the individual consciousness. It's about communal consciousness. And if a novelist writes a really great character, we read it and we say, I feel the same way. And for DeLillo, he's not writing about individual people per se. He's writing about these movements, these masses, and when it feels real, it's when it's actually happening, right? And so, and it's felt on the level of the news, right? Like we see this in headlines, and so I think it also speaks to why he has that kind of prophetic capacity in his writing.
Yeah, yeah. So I've introduced you to as being members of the Don DeLillo Society, but we haven't learned anything about it yet. And for our listeners, the link to the Don DeLillo Society is in the episode notes. But guys, tell us about the Don DeLillo Society, how to get started, and what does it do?
Well, I think I want to say it was your mentor, Aaron, John Duvall, started this thing. Got to be close to 20-ish years ago or something along those lines. And it's
Correct.
had a number of academics who really here to promote DeLillo's work, but mainly the scholarship of DeLillo's work as well. So like a lot of the author societies, we try to get some conference panels or presentations together for some of the conferences each year. For a pretty long time, we had a newsletter going. That's fallen by the wayside a little bit, but maybe we'll get that up and running one of these days again. And we've got some social media again, really to promote DeLillo scholarship, and then over the last couple of years, DeLillo in the news.
Aaron, anything to add to that?
That about sums it up. I think it's been a pretty amazing space to coordinate conference panels. I think is been the most meaningful contribution that I've had personally from it. I worked on the newsletter for a while, and it's just hard to maintain a newsletter like that, with the kind of fact checking that we'd want to do. But yeah, it has that kind of scholarly space, very different from the Don DeLillo Reddit that I've been following more recently.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm glad you doubled on the conferences, because that was how I was able to meet Aaron for the first time, for example, and a lot of the other DeLillo people, DeLillo scholars who are out there. It's really nice to be able to actually meet people in person and not just, see each other's social media or just read each other's academic work.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let me ask you guys, why is Don DeLillo, this might be an impossible question, but why is he so publicity shy? Is he the kind of guy who is protecting kind of the writer's mystery? So actors do that sometimes. Like if they see what I'm like on the Sunset Strip, then I can't sell myself on the silver screen. Um, is that what it is with DeLillo, or is he just a stone cold introvert? Do you know?
Well, I guess a couple of things. One is that if you look over his whole career, which now spans a couple of decades, he's given a number of pretty high profile, significant interviews. I suspect that's all he can give. I think that's all he can do. This peaked probably around when Underworld came out. And my understanding, although this would probably need a little fact checking, is that he got enough money from his publisher that they were like, hey, you've got to actually do some readings and some interviews. So I did see DeLillo read in New York City in maybe 97, 8, 9 or something like that. I'm sure that wasn't his favorite thing to actually go out and do readings and do interviews, but it was part of, promoting this very large book. And he was interviewed more recently in the New York Times Magazine, in conjunction with The Silence. So he gets himself out there, but not as much as, certainly a writer of his stature or profile might. On the other hand, still way more than, let's say, Thomas Pynchon, who has really not done any interviews. And I think he really just believes in letting the work speak for itself. I think that's been kind of his company line for a lot of years. As if you want to know anything about me or you want to know about the work, just read the work.
He's going to get accused of his work being autobiographical anyway. Like every author is told, "Oh, it's autobiographical. This is autobiographical." So yeah, I might as well just say, "Okay, well, there's the work. You come to your own conclusions on that."
I was
How about you,
actually
Aaron?
about to
Any
make
other
a
thoughts on that?
yeah, I was about to make a an autobiographical sort of point about one of his novels, which is Mao 2, where he talks about the reclusive artist. And I don't think of that as an autobiographical character, but I do think that his understanding of authorship is very sincere, very genuine. I think that he does believe in the power of writers to do a thing, even if they've lost some power over the contemporary moment. And in Mao 2, he sort of plays with a character that's doing that. And I would imagine the read that I like to have of DeLillo's reclusiveness is that he is trying not to influence the culture that he's trying to write about. And so to speak about his work is to violate this break between commentary and analysis and participation. Um, that's how I don't know that that's true in any meaningful sense, but that's how I like to think of his reclusiveness, at
It's
least.
an interesting perspective. Yeah, I mean that's an interesting point there. And Don, if you happen to come across a copy of this podcast and you're listening, reach out to me. My email address is in the episode notes. Tried to find your email address. Obviously, you don't make yourself easy to find, Don, but would love to get you on the program if you run across this and you have the bandwidth to do it. In the if you're amenable to the idea, that would be quite a treat for me and for everybody listening to the program. Let me ask you guys about what do you think his most underrated novel is? We know the big ones. Libra was fantastic. Underworld wasn't my favorite, but it was one that was so celebrated. And what we talk about White Noise and Falling Man, maybe to a lesser extent. But is there a novel out there that you consider his most underrated that you think just doesn't get the kind of attention it deserves?
Well, we talked about the major one. I mean, White Noise is still my favorite. Underworld still is the masterpiece. New York Times did a kind of essential Don DeLillo last week, and I had to grudgingly admit, or that I agreed. I was hoping that I'd find a lot to disagree with, but like, no, yeah, start with White Noise. Read Underworld next. It's the masterpiece. Mike, if you want to try this, this is going to sound like bad news. You have to start Underworld again almost immediately after you finish it. So this thing is like 830 something pages. You finish it, you go back to page one. It makes so much more sense the second time you read it, in part because of the connections and the what he's doing with chronology. The thing has to be read twice.
That
Um,
is that is I was actually thinking that I probably should go back a second time on that one. Although now it's been a lot of time has passed. I will tell you this, just I want to slip this in because one of you said that his writing almost begs to be read aloud because of the poetry of it. And I've listened to a lot of his books on audio. I don't always think the reader is necessarily the best reader for the material. But well, White Noise I've probably read and listened to 10 times. But his other novels have really been kind of except for End Zone, probably two or three times, but a one and done in most cases. Um, but yeah, to that point, that I like hearing his work actually read aloud as well. But what about the most underrated one then, Jesse?
I mentioned Great Jones Street before, which I really like. I also came around on Cosmopolis, which when I read the first time, right when it was published, I didn't think was that great. And I had to have a little more space from it. And maybe I needed to catch up with what DeLillo already knew. And the culture had to catch up a little bit. And I watched the David Cronenberg movie adaptation. So I reread it, in conjunction with that. And that is a surprisingly funny novel, but it's so dry and so cold. Even for him, you can't even laugh out loud at anything. You just have to sort of say in your head, huh, that's funny. Like that's the way that the humor operates. At
Hmm.
one point on Twitter a couple of years ago, there was sort of a hashtag about, like men writing women badly, and a passage from Cosmopolis got caught up in that. And I felt really bad. I was like, no, that's supposed to be the character. The character is bad. The character is not sympathetic. This isn't a writer who doesn't know how to write an exchange. So yeah, so I feel like That's a tricky novel because it's so cold that you have to sort of get into the headspace about what's going on there. And it's another one that in theory has this kind of high concept plot, but most of it is just, a guy sitting in traffic for the entire book, in order to get a haircut. In my mind, I've nicknamed Cosmopolis Long Day's Journey into Haircut.
Aaron,
Okay.
what do you count as the most underrated?
I really like the Great Jones Street poll. I think that's uh, yeah, that's one of my favorites. And one year went home to New York and dragged my family out to the Great Jones Street bar, and I they have a picture of the cover of the novel up on the wall, and it was delightful. But I think I'm gonna throw Falling Man out here. In part not because it's necessarily perceived as a bad novel of his, but because it doesn't quite get the credit that I think that it deserves. It's a fascinating novel, trying to do a lot of things, doesn't always do everything perfectly, but it really makes this. It really demonstrates a turn that DeLillo has made in his writing after Underworld, which is um, this emphasis on more narrow local and emotional characters, and I think it really does capture a moment in a particular way that I think is was very prescient, right? Like Underworld did this massive 50-year sweep of the Cold War, but Falling Man does that on this 5 year, on the 5 year post 9/11 block. And I think that still remains a pretty fascinating novel.
Yeah.
I loved Falling Man. The scene with the character who was in the building when the jetliner struck. I mean that whole scene was so masterfully done by Don DeLillo, and
Yeah.
also talking about the woman with the blood in the eyes, and she had a stroke, and she was being deconstructed by God. I mean, he has these just different perspectives, but the scene of the jetliner hitting and in a man's experience of being there, you would have thought that Don DeLillo had been in the tower and experienced it himself and was able to write about it with great incisiveness. It was just it was really masterfully done.
It actually echoes something that Jesse had said before about reading Underworld and then starting it over again, right? Like there's this cyclicality to his work, right? The novel ends with the collision of these two plot lines that then one of which then starts the novel over, right? The narrative of the person sort of walking our protagonist walking out of the wreckage. And yeah, it's a quality to his work that I think is a little bit more common than we might think. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And
I'm
go
yeah,
ahead,
I'm I'm
Jesse.
I'm glad you brought that one up also because that one is a resolutely not funny novel, and I do tend to gravitate towards his funny novels. Even Underworld has a lot of humor throughout it. It's just there's just so much novel, it's got some of everything. But obviously a novel about 9/11 is not going to be a fun or funny novel. I taught a class called 9/11 and the novel where we did that one. And at some point, one of the students said, like, these books are all so sad. And I like just kind of point at the course title on the syllabus, like, mm-hmm. But part of the real pathos of that novel isn't just the obvious subject matter of it. It's that the novel mainly revolves around this marriage that is falling apart. And it's in some ways, it's just this much, much smaller domestic tragedy that is supposed to be kind of the echo of the giant domestic tragedy. And the way he's able to do that pretty consistently, like kind of get the micro and the macro at the same time, about these marriages, these families, these parents and children, but also the whole culture. It's really remarkable.
Yeah, he can write at this very high, expansive level, but then right down to the individual and the kind of uh, the various dimensions of the individual and so on. I loved Running Dog as well. I thought Running Dog. I think of that as an underrated novel. There's some scenes in there that are remarkable as well. Yeah. I was going to say that he won the National Book Award and he's won other awards. I didn't want to read them off, but he's never won the Pulitzer. I consider the National Book Award as good an award as the Pulitzer Prize. Um, he as great as Don DeLillo is, as much as he's revered by literary critics, he hasn't really won. I mean, John Updike won two Pulitzer Prizes, and a very different writer. But I don't think that most literary critics would put John Updike in the same. I just think DeLillo would be a class above that. I don't think necessarily John Updike would appear in the top three or maybe even five of the greatest novelists of the last 50 years. As good as he was, there's been a lot of great American novelists. Any thoughts about that? The award, and whether he's ever been considered for a Nobel Prize?
He's been considered a couple of times, but he didn't get it, and I don't know that he's going to get it now. Our DeLillo Society adjacent friend and colleague Jeff Severs has a podcast called "Don DeLillo Needs to Win the Nobel Prize" or something along those lines. And another DeLillo scholar, Mark Osteen, had a similar, talk recently where he was saying, DeLillo needs to win the Nobel Prize. When Bob Dylan won it, was that in 2016? My thought was, oh no, that means DeLillo's never going to win it because they're not going to give it to another American that soon again. And he doesn't have that much longer. And not to sound morbid or anything, but he is in his late 80s. So I am not super optimistic that DeLillo is going to get the Nobel, but I think he absolutely should.
Yeah, it's almost like I wonder if maybe people have the judges have difficulty when you win that, they will say for doing this, and it's usually something that's fairly narrow. I'm wondering if they have a difficult time getting a handle on really what Don DeLillo is doing, because he's a far to me he's a far-ranging writer, but you can really kind of synthesize it down to what he talked about, just the understanding the culture, and also that life is dangerous and its many aspects. There's many aspects of life that are very dangerous. You were going to say something, Aaron.
Yeah, I think that is a particular a particular problem with postmodern writers like DeLillo, which is that his writing is difficult. Immediately it's not immediately accessible, right? It requires that you buy into the language and grow accustomed to it. And so it has this kind of like unwelcoming quality to it at first. And I think that probably works against the notion of giving an award to a writer, right? Like he has this pathos to him. He understands the pathos of a culture, but when it comes down to the reading experience for DeLillo is not always pleasant, right? Like even the comedy is not always comedy. The plots aren't real plots. It's just a weird kind of writing, and I think that it doesn't fit a mold in the way that we want it to fit a mold.
Yeah, yeah. Let's walk through. This is really more for the listeners' benefit than for ours. I just want to kind of walk through the 19 novels. Not that we're going to comment on all of them, but the first one was Americana. That's back in 1971. It shows just how long Don DeLillo has been doing this kind of work. His second novel, End Zone, one of my favorites. I found that to be, and I'm a sports fan, but it's not really a sports novel. Somebody had said, calling End Zone a football novel is like calling Catch 22. Maybe it was a movie about war, but it was kind of a movie. I think I'm misquoting that, but basically the idea being that it's much more than a college football player. Gary Harkness is the character there. But his third novel is one that both of you guys like a whole lot, which is Great Jones Street. Followed by Ratner Star, which didn't get a lot of attention, it didn't seem. Players was after that. Then comes Running Dog. Amazons is actually one of the novels I haven't read of his. That's number 7.
And Amazons is a very funny novel, but he will not. He's disavowed that one.
And why is that?
Well, I think, and Aaron, you might know more about this than I do. He might have actually been trying to make some money on Amazon. So he wrote this kind of a sex farce novel under the guise of that this is the first professional female hockey player. It was published under her name as though this were a real person. I think it was
Cleo Birdwell.
Yeah, I think it was
the name.
Yeah, Cleo Birdwell. I think it was co-written, but I don't know who it was co-written with.
Sue Brock or Sue Buck. Subaka
Okay.
says,
Uh,
I'm just looking at the notes here now. Okay. So,
and it really is it's a funny. Now, I was lucky enough to come across a used copy of that in like 1994, 95 when I decided I was going to buy all the DeLillo novels, and I got it pretty cheap. It's gotten very expensive these days. No, but what you're onto, Mike, is that pretty much all of those first novels, up until I would say the names, including Amazon's, are playing around with some sort of genre. That is, he's like picked a genre, the sports novel, and for End Zone, the rock novel for Great Jones Street. These, and he really leans into this genre thing, but then he also picks it apart. Like it doesn't really follow the conventions of what you think these genre novels are supposed to do. And then the
yes,
names, he starts doing something else.
the names is,
Yeah.
hit number 8. Go ahead, Aaron.
Yeah, I was gonna add there, one of my other honorable mention for underappreciated DeLillo novels is Americana, which I've written on a little bit, which is his first novel, and it's this Madison Avenue send up. And to Jesse's point, it's a play on the advertising novel genre that we see in like The Hucksters or Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, and just an analysis of the genre, an analysis of Madison Avenue, and an analysis of American culture more broadly. It's a lot of fun.
Mhm.
So that one features a main character, David Bell. He's a man who survives office purges and scandals to become a high-powered television executive, and obviously television brings with it advertising and so on. So we get to novel number 8 is The Names, and then comes his breakout novel, number 9, White Noise. That's 1985, and that was followed by Libra, which was also an outstanding, very different
Mhm.
historical novel, but he had his own take on it. He grew up just blocks away from Lee Harvey Oswald. Never knew him, but he grew up in a part of New York that Lee Harvey Oswald had grown up in, and he kind of imagined, if I'm recalling this correctly, not in the book, but just this is separate from the book, that their paths probably crossed, and he was uh, just the thought experiment of how do two guys who are basically contemporaries from the same area have such different fates, sort of thing. Do you guys have any uh, insights into that?
Well, he wrote about that in his essay in Rolling Stone called American Blood, which I remember I actually had to go to the big New York Public Library and get that on microfilm. Now you can probably find it online. And he is right. He's pretty explicit about this whole way in which he grew up blocks away from Oswald. Now Oswald was originally from Texas, but he moved around a lot, and he was very interested again in something like the dichotomy that he would revisit in Mao 2, which Aaron already mentioned, of the writer versus the terrorist. And so he is thinking about in some ways turning Oswald into a character, not necessarily because he's a character in Libra, but he felt like he was a character in something like, American culture, American history. What does it look like? What does it feel like to be a person in history but have no agency whatsoever? It's also, again, a very interestingly written novel because it's basically got 3 different plot threads in a way that now I think like almost every movie has an A plot, a B plot, and a C plot, and it goes back and forth in time. But I felt like at that time, it didn't feel like there were nearly as many books and movies that were playing around with multiple plot threads and multiple timelines the way that Libra did. And it's a little bit of a tough novel to get through for that reason. Like you really have to keep track of a lot of different things, including going back to what Aaron mentioned Americana. I mean, a lot of his books are self-aware. So he's got one character who's basically the author character trying to research this and figure out what happened. Um, as a concept too, the idea that this is a Kennedy conspiracy novel, but the conspiracy is that the bullet was supposed to miss, as opposed to, let's say, in the movie JFK or something like that. So really, I mean, I think there's a lot going on, but a lot of it comes down to, again, the writing and the imagination.
It's just I found it to be outstanding, and the thing that helped drive it forward was the story,
Mhm.
what he's writing about, so it kind of allows him to be more diffuse. Although I don't consider this one of his more diffuse novels, but because basically the direction of the story and the conclusion of the story, it it makes the tracking is much easier than your typical DeLillo novel, where it's kind of like this is a virgin story. We're not writing a historical piece here; it's a virgin story. Um, my takeaway anyway. This is when he was on a tear. I mean, he comes out with White Noise, and he wins a lot of acclaim and wins a National Book Award. Then comes a Libra. Then comes Mao 2, which is really kind of a novella. And then his big book, Underworld, which is probably his biggest book, maybe Ratner's Star, is somewhat on that scale. Ratner's Star is a big book just in terms of word count, page count. After Underworld, he got to some smaller books again, almost novellas, The Body Artist and Cosmopolis. What about that period of time? I mean, but the Body Artist and Cosmopolis come along, but then Falling Man, which maybe the critics weren't crazy about it, but we all seem to find a lot of value in that book. That was a great piece of writing. Anything to be said about Mao 2? I know you guys have commented on that a little bit, but I feel like that's right in the middle of his the hot zone there that he had going.
Yeah, Mao 2 is another great novel. I would say that streak of The Names, White Noise, Libra, Mao 2, Underworld, I mean, it's pretty much unrivaled. I can't think of another writer that did what he did with those consecutive novels, except maybe Toni Morrison. Other than that, I don't know anybody pulls that off. But and Mao 2 is also, again, a very, to me, very readable novel because, again, it seems to be about this, actual global terrorism and what this means and the pronouncement about the culture. And as Aaron said, it's got an actual author surrogate in it. But again, it also is very much about these very small relationships between three people.
So you would put The Names also right on the front end of that add that to the streak.
Yeah,
that was your lead-off hitter right there.
Yeah, I'll add that a lot of the DeLillo scholars like The Names the most. Like they'll put The Names ahead of White Noise and even Underworld. I wouldn't do that, but I want to acknowledge all the DeLillo scholars who love The Names. So, but The Names also, that's the pivot because he's not really leaning into this genre subversion anymore. He's really doing I mean, it could be, I guess, the American Abroad genre, but it doesn't really read like that to me. It gets past that really quickly.
Is Amazon's readily available? Like I'm jumping back to Amazon's, which is book number 7. And you said things about it that certainly sound. I wish Don DeLillo had written more funny stuff because I think he's really good at it. And you said that this was a funny one, but he's kind of disavowed it. Is it hard to get a copy, or is it just a matter of you need to fork out $50 or $100 or
I think it's more than that. I think if you go on Amazon.com, you can probably get a used copy, but it's probably at least $250 now.
Wow.
It's been out of print for a long time.
So as we move along, I mentioned The Body Artist, Cosmopolis, Falling Man, then Point Omega, The Angel, Esmeralda, and then Zero K. I didn't really care for Zero K, but and then there's The Silence. Now I want to jump back just for a minute. I know that when I read Underworld, I'm thinking I'm missing something here because everybody loves this book, but I labored with it. And I will say that I don't even like to admit this, but when I first read White Noise, I think you hit on this, Jess. You said, where's this really going? And I remember I was reading maybe 20, 25 pages into it. I gave up kind of quick, put it on the shelf. It was a few weeks later, I picked it up and started from the beginning again, and I just devoured it. It was just, I had locked in and understood this is what this guy's trying to do, and it's brilliant. And it was just, from there, it was terrific. I do need to go back on Underworld and give that a second try, and go deep on that one.
Yeah, I felt that way about Point Omega. I struggled, and that's a short novel. I mean, it's barely even a novel. I had to get into the spirit of the kind of post Underworld books, which are really very spare. I mean, my sense is that he's really writing. He went from kind of this maximalism to minimalism. I think he's leaning into some of his European influences, like Beckett, for example. He's writing almost theater of the absurd kind of plays, and I even prefer to read The Silence as a play at this point. It doesn't even read like a novel to me. You sort of have to just read it the way one would read, like Waiting for Godot or something like that. Otherwise, it just doesn't give you enough to work with.
Yeah, he could be elusive. Let's talk about White Noise, the movie as well, but I wanted to back up for just I was thinking in terms of Robert Altman was the guy to do White. I told people that book is going to be a movie someday, but it can't be a conventional movie. I'm thinking Robert Altman would do kind of a series of vignettes because or find some microcosm within the novel that just concentrate on that for an hour and a half. And then he died. Robert Altman died. And I thought, no, it's never going to get made into a movie. But fortunately, Greta Gerwig, and it's actually her husband, Noah
Yeah,
Baumbach.
no Baumbach. Yeah.
Yeah. And when I heard it was him, I thought this is great. And that she was going to play Babette was terrific. What do you guys think of the movie, though? What was the final outcome? I wasn't thrilled with it personally, but you know, one opinion. What did you guys take away?
You want to jump in, Aaron? I feel like I'm not letting you talk now.
No, we're good. I kind of don't want to jump in. I'm gonna be honest and say I made it to the scene where they're fording across the river and stopped. I what I will say is that it does a really good job of capturing the awkwardness of conversation. I think that the film does a really good job of showing people in various states of inability to converse with one another. But it also sort of reinforces that like White Noise doesn't have a plot either, right? It's similarly not a plot driven novel, even though, it comments on plot driven novels. So anyway, all that's to say, I think it did some things pretty well, about as well as you can with a DeLillo text, but I ultimately struggled with it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I didn't like it at all. I was really looking forward to this thing, and I was a little scared because like this movie that I've been waiting for decades and decades. Look, it had two problems: what it kept from the novel and what it cut from the novel. There, that's my joke. There it is. Uh, I thought the casting was way off. I mean, Noah Baumbach clearly seemed to be coming off of a marriage story, and there definitely is the struggling marriage at the center of White Noise. But to me, that can't be the main thing or the only thing. I thought Adam Driver couldn't have been more miscast in this role. I mean, because part of the novel White Noise is that Jack's kind of slide towards violence, personal fascism, is supposed to be unlikely, unexpected. We're supposed to see traces of it, but his unreliable narration doesn't let him seem aware of it. As soon as you see Adam Driver, like he's going to do something violent. That's just what he is. It's what he does. I was thinking some actor like John C. Riley would have been much better, like somebody who looks like kind of like he could be invisible, like in his song in the movie Chicago. Somebody who's a little bigger, older, and obviously they weren't going to do that. Greta Gerwig was also too young. Now, there are two movies that I would say would be better adaptations of White Noise, but they're not White Noise. One was, if you're familiar with the movie Game 6 with Michael Keaton, that was a DeLillo screenplay that the movie got absolutely no traction. You can get a DVD copy of that relatively inexpensively if you want to see what that looks like. And it's a pretty good kind of companion to White Noise. So I would recommend anybody who was disappointed with the White Noise movie, watch Game 6 and see what you think of that. And then the other is the Barbie movie, which Noah Baumbach and Greta Gerwig made right after White Noise. And I was watching this in the theater with my teenage daughter, and as soon as the Barbie character says something like, I don't remember the exact line, I've only seen it once. You ever think about death? I was like, oh, they've been reading White Noise. This is
Yeah.
so. This is kind of the unlikely combination of White Noise and Barbie. Barbie is very much steeped in White Noise, her existential crisis, the sense of materialism. That was the other, I thought, mistake that the movie made, was setting it in the 1980s and doing it as an 80s period piece. I found it very distracting. I think they probably could have updated it in a way that was much more reasonable.
Yeah. Well, it's unanimous. I didn't like the movie either. The ending was it was kind of a Talking Heads sort of ending to it. Um, Meaning Talking Heads, the band, in kind of that ethos or pathos. But I didn't like it either. I think Aaron, I think is it fair to say that Don DeLillo books do not lend themselves to the silver screen?
Yeah, and it's really weird because, as Jesse suggested, right, like he sort of invented this the maybe that's putting it too strongly, but that A plot, B plot, C plot, like that is the sort of interweaving nature of most of his narratives, and that's pretty common, and we're pretty used to that at this point. The talking head narrator speaking to camera, like we're familiar with these strategies in film now. They should work, but for whatever reason, they don't. And maybe it's just because we want films to be about heroes doing hero things or what, but it doesn't lend itself to that kind of cultural analysis, I don't think.
And
Yeah.
I did think that Cosmopolis was a pretty good adaptation, but I don't know anybody else who liked that movie, just me. So so that might be it. But I always liked David Cronenberg, and of course I love Don DeLillo, and I thought their separate idiosyncrasies actually combined pretty well. And I even liked Robert Pattinson in that movie. I thought he seemed kind of affectless and clueless in a way that was just right.
Yeah, yeah. Um, let me, I was talking before we started recording, Aaron, about how um, there is no biography of Don DeLillo. There's maybe some stuff I think you mentioned, Jesse, that there is some efforts being made right now. Somebody's trying to write one. Can you summarize that for us?
I think it's just in the very early stages, but I have not been to the Ransom Center in Austin to look at his papers. Aaron, have you been? Have you looked at the papers?
I have looked at some of the stuff on
Okay.
Americana, as well as some of the Ogilvy, Benson, and Mather papers in the
Yeah.
Library of Congress about his work
Yeah.
at an advertising agency early on.
I'm going to guess that the biography is going to wind up getting written from the papers and not from the source, because he does have a really, really vast, thorough, boxes and boxes of work that potentially people could go through. He also wrote, he had a lot of pen and paper, or typed letter correspondences with a lot of other writers, younger writers that he wanted to support. So I don't know that the eventual biographer is going to be able to get direct source material from the author, but there's certainly an abundance of materials out there.
I just wonder if is Don DeLillo the kind of guy who's got a lot of friendships and people around him can talk, or is he pretty much a lone wolf and friendships are few and far between? And he does seem like the kind of guy who's very, keeps to himself, contemplative. I think it was Philip Roth who complained that he took a walk with Don DeLillo and didn't get anything out of him. He wanted to, he's a talker and he wanted to have a conversation. And Don DeLillo is more of a guy who listens and observes. He's not a guy who pours out a bunch of perspectives to other people in the spoken word. He's a writer. Um, I don't know if you guys were familiar with that or not, that Philip Roth had been frustrated by DeLillo's taciturn nature.
Now, I didn't know that he
Uh,
was pretty good friends with Paul Auster, who unfortunately just died about 2 weeks ago.
Oh,
Um, but yeah, he seemed to have some actual author friends. I saw DeLillo interviewed in person when he won the St. Louis Literary Book Award, Literature Award, probably about 12 years ago, and he was perfectly fine. But you can definitely hear that this is a person who has to kind of put himself out there. I met him that day too. I got there like 2 hours early because he was going to do a book signing. I was like, oh, I better get there really early because the lines are going to be around the block. And there was nobody there. I was like, well, this is a little silly. I don't know why I thought that there would be hundreds of people lined up to meet Don DeLillo. But he certainly was a sweet enough, nice enough, seemed, very shy seeming guy. He authors spend a lot of time alone, and I'm guessing that's how he prefers it.
yeah, yeah. Um, Aaron, what do we know about, if we know anything at all about what age Don DeLillo was at when he decided I want to be a writer, I want to be a novelist? Was he a teenager? Was it not until his high school or collegiate years? Do we know anything about that?
I don't think we know for certain. I think that the the record shows he moves from Fordham into this advertising agency, and then there's sort of an adage in the 1950s and 60s that every advertiser has an unpublished novel sitting in their desk. And I think at a certain point, he took the unpublished novel and started publishing. He just sort of made a switch sometime in his mid-20s, if I remember correctly, and didn't look back. I think he quit. He freelanced for a little bit longer at the agency, but made the full-time switch over after End Zone, I think.
Interesting. What
Yeah,
about, oh, go ahead, Jesse.
it's funny, but I think he was 27 when Americana came out, and some of the commentary and the reviews at the time were that this was like a relatively late in life first novel, which sounds very funny in 2024.
Uh-huh.
But at the time, it was sort of like, oh, isn't he a little old to be getting into this sort of thing? But yeah, I think Aaron's just right about his kind of trajectory from moving from what he majored at Fordham in communications. And in an interview, he said something called communications, which just is a nice little jab. And then into advertising and copywriting. And then he's, as far as I know, has never even taught writing. He probably could have gotten some really cushy, high-paying teaching gigs at various points that he probably barely would have needed to show up for. And he didn't even want to do that. Like he's really just in it for the work.
Wow, I didn't realize that. So, how did he sustain himself? I mean, early in his career, he wasn't selling that many books, right? I mean, how is he actually paying the bills? Do we even know that?
I got one thing for sure and one thing that's a guess. And one is that he was living, in the lower Manhattan area in the 70s, which was not expensive then. You could actually like money and live in Manhattan, lower Manhattan through the 70s. And I believe he was at some point probably supported by his wife.
Hmm,
That's the conjecture part.
that always helps.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add to that. All I know is that he currently lives in a very swanky part of Westchester County. So
Yeah.
he's clearly his conditions have changed for Mr. DeLillo.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, Aaron, let me ask you, what about his writing regimen? What do we know about that? Was he a guy who got up in the morning and spent 4 hours hammering away? Did he write in the same place all the time? Did he have any particular methodology that he's ever shared? What could you tell us about that?
I actually do not know the answer to that. Jesse, are you more familiar with his sort of writing strategy?
Well, the main thing is that typewriter. Like he was just obsessed with the typewriter. I want to say it was some sort of older German typewriter, but maybe that's just from reading too much Don DeLillo. And he really felt very strongly about the needing to pull the pages out and use like the words on the page. And he, as far as I know, never moved to a word processor. I think even The Silence was written on a typewriter, and when it was published in the Courier typeface in its first edition, which I think is really funny. It was almost like a little hat tip to, hey, this is what it really would have looked like on the page. Does have a couple of funny quotes about that, writers are people who need to set aside an inordinate amount of time so that they can squander it. But I also think that he's is a schedule guy. Like I'm pretty sure he would write for several hours every day on schedule.
Yeah, oh, it would make sense. I mean, when you look at the quality and complexity of his work. Now he's 87. Is he still working? Do we know? And is he working on something specific? He's working on the next novel.
I don't know what he's working on or that he's working on anything, but I sort of wondered when Point Omega came out if that was going to be his last novel, because it's sort of to me read like, the first novel is Americana, the last novel will be Point Omega, kind of this Ada last letter of the alphabet trajectory. But then I was wrong. He kept publishing after that. So I don't know for sure. I wouldn't be surprised if he put out something else. I mean, Cormac McCarthy kind of surprised everybody with those kind of late in life major works that he said he was working on for a long time, but the McCarthy people weren't sure if they were ever going to see.
Yeah. Yeah. And then it came
There's
out with two at once.
Yeah.
there's something about the titles of his last novels that sort of feel like he's petering out, but intentionally petering out, not intellectually petering out. But Falling Man, Point Omega, Zero K, The Silence feels like a nice feels like
Yeah.
a nice conclusion to his oeuvre.
Yeah. It's yeah, almost like yeah, writing kind of some end notes, kind of writing things off at that point. Um, Tell us, just one more question or two. Tell us a few things about Don DeLillo that would surprise us. Are there any trivia type things or surprising things about Don DeLillo that you guys have come to know over the years?
Um,
The
Probably,
silence. There's the title right there. The
yeah.
silence.
I mean, probably that as far as I know, he really did go out of his way to support a number of writers when they were on their way up. I mean, I think pretty famously Jonathan Franzen, David Foster Wallace, more recently Rachel Kushner. Like he wants to make sure that he is supporting writers where he sees them, and I think that's really amazing. Like he's kind of developed into this elder statesman of American writer in a way that maybe people wouldn't get that sense of him from again the reluctance to do some of the interviews.
Interesting. How about you, Aaron?
The only thing I can think of, because it tripped me up when I first learned about it, was just his background in advertising. And that I discovered this when Mad Men came out, and just doing some work on DeLillo, and just seeing that he was a part of that moment in time, a part of that culture, even if low level copy editor style work. Um, it's infused throughout his fiction, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. This sort of like uh, the nature, these like tagline natures, the tagline nature of his sentences, I think is something that continues to stick with me and amaze me even in these later novels, 50 years removed from his career there.
Interesting. So, just in closing, I'd like to get you guys to comment on, what will his place be in the annals of American fiction? I mean, over time, is he going to be remembered for a good deal of time? Are his books being assigned in literature classes around the country by lit professors and so on? Aaron, what do you think? What's his place in history of literature, and how will he be remembered?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, and I think it depends on audience, right? Like Jesse mentioned earlier, that the New York Times had just come out with an article on, DeLillo's work a week ago, and so he's still very much in the zeitgeist, even though he's not publishing at a prolific rate at this point. I think as a New York writer, he embodies the state, so I think in that sense he'll never be gone. I think as a great writer of the 20th century, I don't think that's going. I don't think he's going to drop off of any of those lists. But I do think, Jesse had hinted at this earlier, like in the classroom, where a lot of folks finally come into an awareness of DeLillo as a writer. He's not well liked in the classroom, right? Like students more and more are, struggle with that kind of writing. Um, I I teach at a state school in California, and I taught white noise a couple of times, and the experience of going to college on the hill in the middle of nowhere, these small liberal arts colleges, that's not their experience, and they don't care, and that kind of like residential like feeling is doesn't resonate at all. The characters, 1980s, like the the references stick, but the references don't stick, but the sentiment does. And so, insofar as he's great at providing that kind of sentiment, students will always find something in it that's interesting and compelling. But I teach Pafko at the Wall, just the 50-page introduction to Underworld. I teach it every semester. And last year, I had an open revolt from my students. You cannot teach this. I don't like baseball,
Oh,
which is sort of misses the point. But also, I appreciate it. Like I understand where they're coming from. So in that sense, I think that is a long-term struggle. He doesn't have the same kind of appeal as somebody like a Kurt Vonnegut or some of these other mid 20th century writers. But of course, he's still one of the greatest writers that we've ever produced in this country, and I think that will never go away. So
yeah, that's kind of sad. I count on DeLillo to take me to a different place. So, and it's almost like, no, don't take me to a different place. I want to, keep me in Instagram culture or whatever. That's disappointing. Um, Jesse, how about you?
Well, I do think that, when we think about the writers of this period, in my opinion, they were really just the two greats, and that's DeLillo and Toni Morrison. And other ones are almost great,
Agreed.
but they're
Agreed.
not in their category in terms of, again, some of the stuff we already covered, which is really just something like the cultural imagination, but also the words on the page, the writing. And I'm tempted to make a like Velvet Underground reference. Like the joke about Velvet Underground is that not that many people bought the Velvet Underground's first album, but every single one of them decided to be a musician. And there are so many writers and scholars who read White Noise. And even if they didn't pursue DeLillo as a topic or anything like that, it really spoke to them. So I think that there's a certain kind of person that reads DeLillo and thinks, I mean, this is how I felt again in the early 90s. Wow, this feels like it was written just for me or just for somebody like me. And not in the way some of the students think about it today, which is they need to relate to the characters. Like, I don't really relate necessarily to the characters, but that's not what I mean. I mean something like, again, the language and the cultural sensibility. I feel that way about Toni Morrison. I felt that way about Nathaniel West. I feel that way about Flannery O'Connor. I don't need to be the same as them to get that feeling from reading it. And as long as there are readers that look at it and think, this is really, again, speaking to my sense of language, my sense of culture, there'll be a readership for DeLillo.
Yeah, yeah. Amazing novelist. Jesse and Aaron, thank you for coming on the program. Really appreciate it.
Thank
Thanks
you
for
very
having
much,
us.
Mike.